The panorama of global conflict in the mid-20th century was defined by an overwhelming, impersonal scale. It was a statistical tragedy, measured in divisions mobilized, tons of ordnance dropped, and acreage reduced to uninhabitable ruin. The conflict was a vast, crushing machinery that consumed nations and erased identities, characterized by the biting, unrelenting cold of Eastern Front trenches. The pervasive, acrid smell of cordite and high-octane aviation fuel, and landscapes churned by artillery fire into homogeneous gray mud. Yet, within this cataclysmic furnace, history offers startling, intensely intimate counter-narratives, moments where the machinery fractured, not due to mechanical failure or strategic retreat, but due to the instantaneous moral decision of a single human being. These are the stories of humanity that survived the fighting, tiny acts of grace that required more courage than mounting a frontal assault, revealing the deep, enduring instinct for connection that war attempts, often successfully, to erase. The first such vignette unfolds in the bleak, echoing geometry of a ruined factory district, perhaps in the shattered industrial heart of Stalingrad or the broken suburbs of Aachen. The air here was not silent, but rather filled with a fragile, dangerous quiet, a suspension of direct hostility, punctuated only by the occasional distant mortar thump and the unsettling sound of water dripping slowly into pooled debris. The landscape was a jagged silhouette of twisted steel girders, concrete dust that coated everything in a fine, choking layer, and rubble that shifted ominously beneath the weight of a boot. This environment housed Klaus, a German sniper, a man whose face was etched with the gaunt sharpness of chronic malnutrition and exhaustion. The cold metal of his rifle, his most constant companion. He had occupied a compromised perch within the third floor of a skeletal administrative building for 72 hours, living on stale bread and the adrenaline of perpetual vigilance. Below, in the shadow of a collapsed loading dock, lay Corporal Robert Miller, an Allied infantryman, critically wounded hours earlier by shrapnel that had torn through his abdomen. He was alone, his squad forced to pull back under heavy fire, leaving him with the sickening, metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. And the agonizing realization that his survival was measured in minutes unless help arrived. He was visible, yet unreachable, and Klaus, through the powerful magnification of his scope, had tracked Miller's deteriorating condition with objective precision. The rules of engagement were clear. An enemy combatant was a target, wounded or not. The necessity of war demanded neutrality to suffering. But in the sterile, shared horror of that ruined place, neutrality dissolved. Klaus watched the desperate, shallow breaths Miller attempted to draw, saw the gray pallor spreading beneath the grime on his skin, recognized the reflection of his own proximity to death in the soldier's eyes. It was not pity that moved him, perhaps, but a profound recognition of mutual existence in extremis. They were two mammals cornered in the same collapsing den. Klaus made a decision that risked summary execution under his own command. He descended. The approach was agonizingly slow, a tense ballet of self-exposure. He left his rifle secured, taking only a small, water-stained field dressing kit, and a sliver of the hard, greasy sausage and bread ration he had been hoarding. When he reached Miller, the Allied soldier stiffened, expecting the final sharp report of a pistol. Instead, he felt the surprising, rough tenderness of hands cleaning the wound, stanching the flow with practiced, if unsophisticated, application of pressure and bandage. Klaus spoke minimal, broken English, enough only to convey instruction. Hold. Quiet. He gave the bread and sausage, a simple, life-sustaining exchange of energy. The ultimate anti-transaction, in a war built on taking. For 20 minutes, in the chilling echo of the ruins, two enemies existed in a silent, unspoken truce, sharing a desperate human moment. Before Klaus retreated back to his post, leaving the gaunt silence to settle once more. Fractured now by the indelible impression of shared survival. Miller survived the night, later captured by a more orthodox German patrol, but carrying the knowledge of that momentary, impossible kindness woven into the fabric of his escape from death. The narrative shifts geographically and climatically, moving from the biting European cold and concrete dust to the crushing intensity of the Pacific theater. Here, the war was fought not just against men, but against the environment itself, the oppressive green foliage, the claustrophobic density of the jungle canopy. That filtered the light into sickly yellow-green smears and the relentless, suffocating humidity. That turned skin raw and equipment rusty within hours. The air smelled perpetually of damp earth, salt water, and the metallic sting of recently expended ammunition. We follow a grizzled Marine patrol, hardened by weeks of desperate island fighting, their uniforms bleached and torn, caked with sweat and coral dust. Sergeant Davies led the patrol, a man whose nerves were perpetually taut, accustomed to the sudden, explosive violence hidden behind every curtain of vines. Their mission was a routine sweep after a brutal engagement, the objective being the clearing of stragglers and the securing of crucial high ground. Every shadow was scrutinized, every rustle interpreted as imminent danger. During the sweep of a shell-pocked clearing near what had once been a small coastal village, they found her, a girl no older than 7, small and utterly alone. Kiko. She was curled beneath the protective, tangled roots of a massive banyan tree, covered in dirt and silent with a fear so profound. It had arrested her ability to move. She wore the remnants of a simple, dark kimono, now ragged, and her eyes, wide and luminous with terror, reflected the violence she had witnessed. For Davies and his men, the sight was a rupture in the expected binary of war. The enemy was supposed to be armed, uniformed, and lethal. This was only terror and vulnerability. The immediate instinct of some men was caution, fear that she might be a decoy, or simply the unwanted baggage of a dangerous landscape. But Davies saw only the child, isolated from the machinery of conflict. Halting the sweep was an immense risk, violating the cardinal rule of constant movement in hostile territory. Davies approached slowly, hands raised, the dense air thick with the tension of incomprehension. The language barrier was absolute. He pulled a meager item from his deep pocket, a standard military ration bar of dark chocolate, already beginning to melt slightly. Under the relentless tropical heat, the foil wrapper sticking to the sticky surface. He knelt, offering the simple sweetness. Kiko hesitated, fixated on the large foreign man, whose uniform suggested death. When she finally accepted it, her small hand trembled violently as she unwrapped the foil. The act was trivial, yet monumental, the offering of an insignificant comfort against the backdrop of desperate, merciless fighting. The chocolate, a symbol of childhood and temporary relief, became an emblem against the savagery of their surroundings. Davies decided then and there that they could not leave her. Protecting her became a logistical and moral imperative, more pressing than securing the designated objective. They fashioned a crude sling, and Sergeant Davies himself carried the terrified orphan back through the jungle paths toward a field hospital. A deliberate act of deceleration in a war driven by acceleration. The sticky residue of the melting chocolate on Kiko's small brown hand became a physical manifestation of a protective shield. proving that even in the sweat-soaked savagery of the jungle, the imperative to shield innocence could override the tactical demands of the moment. The memory of that small, silent transfer of kindness, enacted under the oppressive canopy, was one of the few things Davies later admitted allowed him to sleep without nightmares. The third chapter in this documentation of moral defiance takes us away from the immediacy of combat and into the cold historical vaults beneath Europe's ancient cities, Florence, Paris, London. Cities that throughout the 1940s were subject to the devastating caprice of aerial bombardment. Here, the war was not fought with rifles and bayonets, but with careful inventories, delicate packing materials, and the profound weight of history. The enemy was the bomb blast, the firestorm, and the indifference of destruction. In these damp, cavernous underground spaces, the air was cool, heavy with the smell of centuries of accumulated dust, mildewed stone, and archival paper. Above the historic, cobbled streets, the nightly crescendo of air raid sirens and the shuddering concussion of high explosives were a constant reality, threatening to obliterate 10 generations of human achievement in a single fiery instant. Yet down below, separated from the chaos by thick layers of masonry and earth, a unique collaboration took shape. This was the quiet, determined alliance between soldiers, engineers, and transport specialists from various militaries, often working under command structures that understood the value of cultural assets. And the dedicated, often elderly, curators and art historians who had dedicated their lives to these artifacts. The goal was simple, but audacious: to shield priceless, vibrant Renaissance masterpieces, illuminated manuscripts, and classical sculpture from the aerial fire raging above. Imagine the scene in a makeshift vault beneath Uffizi or the Louvre. Focused lamps cut through the subterranean gloom, illuminating the intensely concentrated faces of uniformed men and civilian experts. The soldiers, accustomed to handling heavy ordnance and field equipment, learned the precise, nerve-wracking skill of handling canvases. Titians, Raphaels, and Rembrandts. Masterworks where every square inch represented irreplaceable human effort. They worked swiftly but gently, prioritizing the endurance of history over the immediacy of the current battle. The sensory contrast was stark. Outside, the flash and roar of anti-aircraft fire. Inside, the hushed, almost reverent tones of curators directing the placement of crates. The smooth, cool texture of marble sculpture was wrapped meticulously in thick blankets. The vibrant, living colors of frescoes and oils were protected within custom-built, heavy wooden crates, often secured using straw and sawdust as cushioning, the ancient scent of which mingled strangely with the faint diesel fumes from the trucks waiting to transport the treasures deeper into the countryside. This act was an affirmation that the fight was not merely for territory or political ideology, but for civilization itself. It required a unique brand of courage, not the instantaneous bravery of a charge, but the sustained, intellectual commitment to future generations. German engineers might oversee the reinforcement of a vault wall, while Italian restorers supervised the meticulous lowering of a sarcophagus. In that deep, damp quiet, all uniforms were temporarily set aside in favor of a shared uniform of custodianship. These were fleeting moments of peace forged in the shadow of war, where the universal language of art and history transcended the violent demarcations of the front line, ensuring that the legacy of Western civilization did not become just another pile of gray rubble. The fourth story takes us directly into the heart of urgent ethical decision-making, the frontline aid station. Unlike the sprawling general hospitals far behind the lines, these stations were sterile yet blood-stained environments, often set up in converted barns, large tents, or commandeered schools. existing in a perpetual state of controlled chaos, just miles, sometimes only yards, from the active conflict zone. The air in these spaces was thick with the chemical smell of disinfectant, ether, and the metallic tang of fresh blood, all layered over the inescapable scent of nearby battle, burnt cordite and damp earth. Dr. Eleanor Ellara, an Allied surgeon, worked with relentless, exhausting focus. Her world was reduced to the sharp beam of the operating lamp, the demanding rhythm of her assistants counting, and the steady, insistent beep of monitoring equipment. A sanctuary of precision within the sloppiness of war. The patients arriving were a steady stream of trauma, categorized only by the urgency of their wounds. One afternoon, amidst a surge of casualties, a new arrival was wheeled in. He was pulled from the twisted, smoldering aluminum wreckage of a downed fighter plane nearby. He was unconscious, critically burned, and bleeding profusely from severe abdominal trauma. His uniform was unrecognizable in parts due to the fire damage. But the remaining fabric, a distinct shade of gray and specific insignia, identified him unequivocally as an enemy pilot, Luftwaffe. For Dr. Ellara, the decision was immediate and absolute. The Hippocratic Oath, the centuries-old promise to treat the sick without bias, was not merely a professional ideal. It was the inviolable standard that defined her existence in the midst of organized destruction. She did not see a political opponent. She saw trauma, anatomy, and life slipping away. The uniform became irrelevant, merely an outer layer covering the vital organs she needed to reach. The operation was complex and protracted. Dr. Elara's hands, tired but miraculously steady, moved across the sterile field. She worked against the clock and the trauma, her concentration so intense that the distant rumble of artillery became nothing more than white noise. Her team, nurses, orderlies, and anesthesiologists, followed her lead without question. They treated the enemy pilot with the same meticulous attention and access to limited resources they would afford a compatriot, expending scarce blood plasma and precious surgical expertise to stabilize a life dedicated just hours before to destroying them. The tension in the room was palpable, not born of moral conflict, but of sheer... The tension in the room was palpable, not born of moral conflict, but of sheer medical effort. The physical act of stitching muscle, repairing organs, and sealing vessels became a profound political statement against the backdrop of World War. She upheld the ethical boundary of her profession, proving that even when the entire world was dedicated to division and death, there existed a core human contract, a commitment to preserve life that transcended the conflict itself. The enemy pilot was stabilized and eventually transferred back to a prisoner of war medical facility. His survival was a testimony not only to the surgeon's skill, but to the defiant persistence of medical ethics in the face of violent ideology. The final scene in this collection of salvaged humanity requires a generational leap. Fast-forwarding decades past the cessation of fighting and into the quiet, reflective safety of the post-war world. The landscape is now one of reconstruction and memory, where the visceral textures of cordite and concrete have been replaced by the quiet hum of modern life, the soft scent of polished wood, and the comfortable creak of age. The setting is a small, well-lit cafe in a European city, the quiet murmur of conversational French or German providing a peaceful backdrop. Two men, both elderly, sit across from each other. They wear the subtle marks of age, creases around the eyes, hands showing the slight tremor of years. But their bearing retains the faint, rigid posture of men who once knew war intimately. Their connection, however, was not forged in a trench or a shared barrack, but in a single, desperate moment that had been almost lost to the torrent of history. They were former adversaries, Hans, who had served in a tank division deep in the Ardennes forest, and David, an Allied infantry sergeant caught behind enemy lines during a winter offensive. The precise details of their original encounter are hazy now, colored by the patina of time and the filters of memory. But the central act remains clear. Hans coming upon the wounded and exposed David during a temporary retreat, had made a similar choice to Klaus, the sniper. A moment of medical intervention and the sharing of precious frozen resources, enough to keep David alive until he could escape or be found. For decades, their only tangible link had been a single salvaged artifact, a small sepia-toned photograph, slightly bent and faded at the edges. It was a hasty, illicit snapshot taken by Hans's driver in the fleeting seconds before the tank column was ordered to move out. A silent image showing the two men leaning against a snowy, camouflage-netted vehicle, sharing a rationed cigarette. Their faces grimmed with frost and exhaustion, yet momentarily relaxed in the shared act of survival. The reunion was facilitated by exhaustive work through veterans' archives and the persistent tracking of fragmented memories.
When they finally met, the recognition was immediate, startlingly clear, despite the 40 years and the alterations of age.
There were no grand declarations, no need for detailed recounts of strategy or tactics. The conversation centered instead on the weather that day, the biting cold that felt like needles on the skin, and the specific texture of the coarse tobacco they had shared. Hans pulled the photograph from a worn leather wallet, the paper thin and fragile beneath his thick thumb. David reached out and gently touched the image of his younger self, a man frozen in a moment of pure vulnerability and unexpected trust. The physical object served as irrefutable proof that compassion, though momentary and often dangerous in the grand sweep of the war, leaves permanent, indelible connections. Their shared silence held the weight of untold history and profound gratitude. The handshake that finally sealed the reunion was firm and lasting. It was a gesture acknowledging that the bonds of mutual, instantaneous humanity, the willingness to recognize the sacredness of life, over the manufactured requirements of hostility, are scars stronger than the conflict itself. These 5 acts, spanning continents and climates, the sniper's aid, the Marine's protection, the curator's vigilance, the surgeon's oath, and the decades-long connection of 2 tired veterans, do not erase the tragedy of World War II. But they stand as vital, irrefutable evidence that even when institutionalized hatred attempts to define an entire era, the individual conscience remains the ultimate, final, and most compelling frontier of moral survival.